The ship's engines thudded in slow rhythm beneath the steel deck, one heartbeat for every mile gained westward. Salt mist clung to everything, railings, faces, even the buttons on the prisoners' ash-gray coats. The Atlantic wind cut through them with a smell like iron and rain. Huddled at the starboard rail stood General Karl Heinrich Vogler, age 52, commander without an army. A month earlier, he had commanded 15,000 men near the Rhine. Now he was one of 60 generals confined to this transport ship bound for an enemy's shore. Orders forbade conversation with the crew, yet rumors whispered between prisoners filled every corner of the deck. "America is in chaos," said one. "Their cities burn. They need us as trophies." Another muttered, "It's theater. They will parade us before their mobs." A third spoke with hollow conviction. "They starve behind their machines. They live on canned food and slogans." Vogler said nothing. The Reich Ministry of Propaganda had drilled these claims into every radio broadcast for years. But doubt, once whispered, multiplies in silence. At dawn, the call came landfall. The prisoners were ordered topside. Boots scraped, guards shouted, diesel engines growled as the vessel crept through gray fog. Then the mist parted, and disbelief swept the deck like wind. New York Harbor unfurled before them, not ruins, but radiance. Cranes moved like giants lifting city blocks. Ferries streamed wake ribbons across the water. Freight barges loaded with coal slipped under skeletal bridges that gleamed in morning light. Beyond them rose towers, rows of glass and stone, untouched by war, sharp against the sun. The skyline looked impossibly alive. Vogler squinted at it, the salt stinging his eyes. "It's a mirage," his aide whispered. No one answered. Even the ship's guards seemed quieter, as if the view subdued friend and foe alike. Then came the smell, the metallic sweetness of oil blending with roasted coffee from shore warehouses, the faint trace of baking bread. Civilization had an aroma he hadn't inhaled in years. He flashed suddenly to Berlin, streets littered with rubble, charred plaster dust choking the air, the reek of despair baked into stone. Here, the wind carried abundance. The prisoners lined the deck rail, motionless, a gallery of disbelief. General Hermann Dentz, once a decorated staff officer, spoke without irony. They said democracy was decadent, perhaps it merely went unfed. Others sneered reflexively, but their eyes betrayed curiosity. As the ship slipped past Staten Island, they saw the Statue of Liberty. Her green torch caught the new sunlight like burnished gold. Laughter rippled uneasily among them. "So she still stands," someone murmured in German. One officer saluted her half in mockery, half in awe. When the vessel finally moored at the docks, Americans waited not with jeers or triumph, but with professional indifference. Cargo cranes swung above, stevedores shouted coordinates, civilian clerks stacked forms. The efficiency of it unsettled the generals more than hostility would have. Here was victory drilled not by force but by habit. As they were led down the gangway, cameras flashed. Reporters jotted notes while soldiers herded them onto waiting trucks. No one struck them. No one spat. Instead, an American colonel, their escort, removed his cap, nodded politely, and said, "Welcome to the United States, gentlemen." The translator's voice repeated the words in German, and for a heartbeat they hung suspended in unreality. Welcome. Vogler stepped onto solid ground, the wooden dock vibrating faintly from cranes moving freight. Farther inland, the skyline shimmered through industrial haze. Tanks of gasoline, lines of trucks, stacks of crates, stamped with factory names he'd never heard. He realized that every unit of industry around him worked like a symphony without conductor, each player following invisible rhythm. The docks smelled of sweat, steel, and optimism. The noise was furious, yet ordered. America's informal authority performed through motion, not salute. Vogler turned toward the harbor again, watching the statue's silhouette diminish with distance. He felt the war shrink too, collapsing behind him into the wake that glittered briefly and was gone. Nothing around him matched the enemy he had imagined. Germany had called this a country of improvisation, yet it looked engineered by confidence. He found himself thinking, if this is decadence, what does strength look like? The convoy rolled forward through a city unscarred. In the hum of its engines rose a new kind of thunder, the sound of a world that had already decided what tomorrow would be. The convoy of military trucks rattled out of New York Harbor, weaving through downtown streets that shimmered under a clean morning sun. The generals, sitting in the back of open-air vehicles, clung to the benches as skyscrapers flanked them like canyon walls. Every window glinted with light. From those heights hung laundry, radio antennas, and the ordinary rhythm of civilian life. No city in Germany looked like this anymore. For the high command of a vanished Reich, it was unbearable to compare. Berlin had been reduced to soot and silence. Munich, to empty shells of churches and twisted tram lines. Yet here, the enemy's metropolis pulsed, as if untouched by apocalypse. There were no ration lines, no bomb craters, only shop fronts filled with goods the generals hadn't seen since before the Depression. Tires, fruit, phonographs, newspapers. A woman in a yellow dress crossed the street holding a child's hand, and the convoy of German captives turned their heads at once, momentarily forgetting that they were prisoners. Their disbelief thickened into quiet as the trucks moved north toward the rail yards. A few whispered, "They are pretending. This is staged for us." But every mile drew new evidence that it was not. Freight trains drifted past carrying lumber and cattle. American workers waved to the guards as though nothing was extraordinary about escorting former enemy commanders through their city. From the rail depot, the prisoners were loaded into Pullman-style cars, padded seats, windows that opened easily, even a baggage rack for their duffels. The absurd comfort embarrassed them. Two guards stationed in the aisle removed their caps, nodded, and offered them coffee in paper cups. For men still expecting punishment, those gestures unsettled more than hostility would have. The train headed south toward Fort Hunt, Virginia, and then farther into the country. The scenery changed quickly, steel and smoke giving way to meadows dotted with barns and white-steepled towns. Children riding bicycles paused to stare at the locomotive thunder by. Some waved. None shouted insults. It was the first time the prisoners had glimpsed enemy civilians who looked untouched by exhaustion. In Europe, 6 years of war had chiseled faces into suspicion. Here, the strangers lining the tracks smiled with the unself-conscious confidence of people certain of tomorrow. Their escorts said little. The commanding colonel, an officer named Williams, answered questions with efficient courtesy. When asked if the states had suffered much bombing, he paused as though not understanding the question. "No Germans ever reached us," he said matter-of-factly. Then, seeing their disbelief, he added, "Your subs came close, but no damage." The explanation struck them more sharply than contempt. Their enemy had been untouchable. By late afternoon, the train slowed through farmland quilted in green. Vogler pressed his palm to the window and realized the tracks ran perfectly straight for miles. "Imagine laying rails this flat," someone muttered, half admiring, half aghast. They built an empire by geometry. Even their agriculture reflected strategy rows aligned like drill formations, barns painted bright red as if celebrating abundance. At Fort Hunt, the generals descended into a gentler captivity than they had imagined. They were led not to cages, but to a campus of low barracks shaded by oak trees. Each group had officers' quarters with clean bedding and desks. Water ran clear and plentiful. Every man received 3 uniforms, U.S. Army khaki stenciled with POW, freshly laundered. Daily meals included meat, vegetables, milk, and bread, baked on site. As prescribed by Geneva, the interpreters said, almost teasingly. Vogler noticed that regulations were enforced without shouting. Orders were given once, in calm voices, and obeyed immediately. Disciplined by consent, it was a military language he did not yet speak. The United States government had multiple reasons for bringing its prominent captives here: information, negotiation, maybe future leverage. But the practical reason was simpler space. American soil was distant from vengeance, unscarred enough to hold enemies without hatred. Thousands of POWs picked crops, built roads, or repaired equipment, while their generals stayed in these guarded enclaves, undergoing long debriefings under the supervision of polite men with fountain pens. Yet the capture produced an unintended experiment in sociology. After years preaching German superiority, the Reich's highest officers found themselves living inside efficiency greater than anything they had authored, inside comfort maintained by ordinary citizens. At night, lying awake in spotless barracks, they listened to the country's noise carry over the river, freight trains, church bells, laughter from nearby baseball fields. These were not the sounds of decadence. They were the cadence of a nation sure of its direction. The generals began to ask questions quietly among themselves. How could a nation of such wealth and disorder defeat a disciplined Europe? How could democracy, messy, argumentative, decentralized, produce power so serene they had not been humiliated by force? They were being dismantled by example. The longer they remained in America, the less their captivity resembled imprisonment. The shock of freedom inside confinement, the quiet paradox, was what unsettled them most. Fort Hunt was never intended as punishment. The U.S. Army Intelligence Service treated it as a laboratory for understanding, a place to study the minds that had driven Europe into darkness. Yet for the men behind those fences, it became something stranger, a vision of a civilization they had been blind to. Daylight revealed the rhythm of the place. Trucks brought milk from local dairies. Young soldiers in spotless shirts unloaded not whips, but newspapers. At 0700 sharp, prisoners were served breakfast oatmeal, fruit, coffee. At 7:30, lectures began. Some about agriculture, others about engineering, ostensibly to keep intellects occupied. There was conversation instead of coercion, curiosity where they expected contempt. One morning, a U.S. officer named Captain Hollis arrived to discuss logistics. He was barely 30, with sandy hair and a calm voice that cracked into humor every few minutes. He asked General Vogler to sketch how the Wehrmacht had managed supply lines along the Eastern Front. They drew maps across the same blackboard, inch for inch, men who months earlier would have aimed artillery at one another. When the session ended, Hollis handed Vogler chalk, dusted onto his hands. "Your roads," he said, "were genius, but you ran them like a clock wound too tightly." Vogler blinked at the bluntness. No propaganda, just analysis. The conversation stopped him cold because it assumed equality. An enemy treating him as a peer meant the ideology he'd lived by of superiority, earned through titles and rank, had evaporated. By autumn 1945, the generals were moved to other camps inland Algona, Iowa, Butner, North Carolina, Troutville, Virginia. Each relocation peeled away another layer of expectation. Crossing the Mississippi by rail, they saw towns buzzing with consumer life, grocery signs lit even in full sunlight, children dragging radio flyer wagons down sidewalks, women in polka dot dresses buying fruit that seemed inexhaustible. Every American landscape looked rehearsed for abundance. Propaganda had warned them that liberty led to laziness, that democracy was mob rule. But the democracy they saw wore work clothes. It farmed, paved highways, and kept factories running at dawn with no Gestapo to watch over it. At Camp Butner, they met their guards, mostly reservists and college graduates waiting for discharge. One had studied philosophy at Ohio State. He loaned the prisoners a copy of Emerson's essays and said, "You'll like this one, Self-Reliance." It sounds like your Nietzsche, but it smiles more. The men read under bare bulbs, late into night, line by line, learning a language of authority that didn't depend on fear. No one orders him, one general murmured. He orders himself. The small revelations kept compounding. When Christmas arrived, the guards hung thin paper garlands between the dining hall rafters. After the meal, turkey with cranberry dressing, nearly identical to what the Americans ate, they distributed gift parcels from humanitarian groups. Inside each were cigarettes, writing paper, and a card printed with a single word, peace. It wasn't propaganda. It looked handmade, almost naive. Vogler tested the letters with his thumb, as if the ink itself might smudge into motive. No trick, just intention. Then came the reunion of opposites, General Vogler with General Claiborne Reese, a veteran of Patton's staff who visited the camp as liaison. Reese entered the barracks unceremoniously, saluted, and said, "We never met on the field. Let's meet properly now." He clasped Vogler's hand without hesitation. The contact sliced through the last emotional armor left. In that handshake was the final insult to ideology. Kindness unfazed by rank. The guards noticed a change soon after. The German officer's posture, once stiff with theatrical pride, relaxed. They nodded to sentries they had previously ignored. They even helped organize Sunday concerts using a donated piano. The music was not German marches, but Beethoven, chosen because it belonged equally to both sides. A week later, the local newspaper reported the event beneath an understated headline, "Former Enemies Present Recital." The article's tone, matter-of-fact, almost cordial, circulated in nearby towns. Shop owners began writing to the camp commander requesting POW labor for harvest seasons. In a democracy, even forgiveness became contractual. For the generals, each day brought another small humiliation disguised as comfort. When new boots were issued, they were American-made but fit perfectly. When letters from Germany arrived describing hunger, Vogler noticed guilt bloom among his peers. They were eating meat twice a week while their country scraped for grain. Their captors, who owed them nothing, were feeding them better than home ever had. "Perhaps," said General Dentz one evening, "the real inequality is moral, not material." Soon the interrogations less resembled debriefings and more conversations about political philosophy. Hollis asked if any of them understood the word accountability as Americans used it. Vogler replied cautiously, "We were accountable only upward. You seem accountable outward to each other." Hollis smiled. "That's the difference between fear and law." Every exchange left a bruise that healed into admiration. Months turned into a curriculum of paradoxes. The longer they lived under their enemies' rules, the more civilized those rules seemed. Meals were served punctually. Guards saluted politely. Justice, when discipline was needed, was adjudicated transparently, even appealing to witnesses. Such procedures would have been unthinkable in their own command courts. Each night, when the distant freight whistle echoed over camps already covered in snow, Vogler would glance toward the horizon and imagine all that rail and power laying across one continent, the tangible proof of an orderless order. "They do not worship the state," he noted in his diary. "They worship the idea that the state belongs to them." The great reversal was complete. In the country they once called culturally inferior, they found an efficiency born not of obedience, but of trust. Every horizon of barbed wire turned into a lecture on democracy's geometry. Every sunrise in captivity emphasized freedom's astonishing calm. By the summer of 1946, most German generals in American camps had learned that their captivity would end soon. Repatriation lists circulated, and with them came a strange melancholy. Home meant wreckage. America had become the nearest functioning idea of civilization. For General Karl Heinrich Vogler, the final revelation came not from an interrogation or a speech, but from a simple invitation. The camp commandant had arranged a tour of a nearby town for a handful of officers judged cooperative. Vogler joined reluctantly, expecting propaganda. The trucks rolled through open gates for the first time. They passed farms so orderly they looked rehearsed, cows grazing within perfect fences, tractors gleaming under stored sunlight. Then came the town Algona, Iowa. Red brick storefronts, a movie theater promoting a Sinatra film, the scent of cut hay and gasoline. Yet what stunned the men most were the people's eyes. Shoppers looked up not with hatred or fascination, but with casual acknowledgement. A grocer waved. A child, seeing uniforms, handed them a stick of gum as if generosity were reflex. To a class raised on fear, indifference this kind felt holy. They were escorted to a grain elevator, an industrial cathedral of the plains. Inside, conveyor belts clattered beneath arched beams tall as church vaults, carrying tons of golden corn skyward. An American engineer explained the process in good-humored detail. Feeds cattle, feeds people, feeds exports, keeps liberty fat, he joked. Vogler gazed upward at the flow of grain civilization, literally ascending before him. He turned to Dents and whispered, "They devote architecture to food." The other officer answered quietly, "And we devoted it to power." That night, back at camp, Vogler requested paper. He drafted a letter fewer than 2 pages long, addressed to no one in particular, half confession, half farewell. "I came to this country expecting to measure its weapons and have instead measured its conscience. Here the factories sing louder than armies. They are ruled by imagination, not ideology." He left the letter unsigned, folded it into a drawer of the small writing desk provided by his hosts. When the time for departure came, the formalities were brief. Each prisoner received a ration parcel, $20 in compensation for labor, and a stamped document certifying honorable conduct. Before boarding the ship at Norfolk, the officers stood one final time on an American pier. Rain dotted their caps. Steel cranes swung overhead, unloading trucks full of household goods. War had already vanished into production again. An aide asked Vogler what he would most remember of America. He said simply, "Its noise, the noise of creation." The voyage home mirrored the first, yet none of them looked back with contempt. Through fog they saw again the Statue of Liberty, a peacetime audience now greeting them not as enemies but as men returning to history's unfinished lesson. Silence spread along the deck, except for one whispered remark that several later repeated, "She faces east toward Europe, perhaps still waiting for us to learn." In later years, those captured officers would cite their imprisonment in America as the beginning of their reconciliation with democracy. Some advised the rebuilding of the West German Army, restructuring it along principles they had first glimpsed through barbed wire authority answerable to the governed. Others refused to serve at all, instead writing memoirs confessing that the true defeat of the Reich happened not on battlefields, but in the moment they saw how decency functioned when it did not need spectacle. For Vogler, the legacy condensed into one image: a factory whistle at dawn outside Camp Algona, rising into limitless sky. Unlike the mechanical terror of German sirens, it signaled beginnings, not alarms. Every morning it reminded him that power which serves creation instead of destruction is a rarer kind of victory. Long after his return to Germany, when journalists interviewed him about American captivity, Vogler spoke softly, as though still uncertain that freedom could sound so ordinary. "They lived abundance without arrogance," he said. "It was the first time I saw authority restrained by choice. In seeing America, the conquerors finally understood that the loudest strength need not shout." Freedom's discipline, the ability to master power through grace, was the sight that ended the war for them.